Hello, friends. It is January 14th, 2020, and it has been a while since I have checked in with you to see how you're doing in the Bible in a year. Thought maybe we could catch up just a little bit. Thank you for your prayers as I was gone to Kansas City last week for school, and it feels great to be done. I'll go back in July for the actual graduation ceremony, and I can just soak that up and not have to worry about any assignments or being in class. So that's a good feeling. So Genesis, how you coming with Genesis? As I'm reading along with you, I think we are almost up to Joseph, where I don't think he's been introduced yet, but that will be coming shortly. So what I wanted to talk to you about is Abraham, because Abraham gets a lot of biblical ink, doesn't he? Father Abraham. We sing the song in Jam, you know, Father Abraham has many sons as Father Abraham, and I am one of them, and so are you. So let's just praise the Lord. Right? So the call of Abram, he's Abram before God changes his name to Abraham, and his wife Sarai before she is Sarah, right? So Abram stems from Shem, Noah's son Shem. There's that genealogy in chapter 11 that you read through. Genesis 11 was on January 5th. Then the Lord told Abram, leave your country, your relatives, your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. So God is calling him to pick up and just leave. But God also promises him that he's going to be with him. And I will cause you to become the father of a great nation. We know that that's going to be Israel. Abram doesn't know that yet. Now, if you in your reading, you will note that Abram's family did not worship God. They were worshiping a bunch of idols, weren't they? And yet God called Abram to be his guy, his chosen one. And God says, I will bless you and make you famous. I will make you a blessing to others. And so Abram departed as the Lord instructed him. Now, my favorite part of this whole Abram story is Genesis chapter 15, verse 5. Abraham is doubting. But God, I don't understand how all of this is going to work. You know, you tell me I'm going to be a father, and a father of many. But my wife and I have tried to have kids, and no luck. And here I am. I'm getting up there in age. I don't understand the details. This is the covenant promise. Covenant means that. Promise. And so God takes Abram outside of the tent. And the Lord took Abram outside. And he says, look up. Look up at the stars. You can't even count them all. Count them if you can. Excuse me. That's how many descendants you're going to have. Can you picture this in your mind? With Abram, we get this intimate relationship. This is God's really first biblical intimate relationship with us through Abram. And it's beautiful. The Lord took Abram. You know, did he take him by the hand? We don't know. It's like, come on, Abram, come outside with me. Look at all of these beautiful stars. You're going to be the father of great nations, outnumbering all of these beautiful stars. So isn't that a beautiful picture? And then it says, and Abram believed the Lord. For now. But again, time passes and no kids, and they're waiting and they're waiting and they're anxious, and God's got a plan. I've got this little sign on my office door that I have to abide into, and it says, "Hello, this is God. I will not be needing your help today." In other words, God's got this, and trust in Him. And so we see in our story that they get tired of waiting. Well, Sarah especially gets tired of waiting, and so she takes matters into her own hands, and she gives her slave girl Hagar to Abram. And Hagar and Abraham have a baby, don't they? Baby boy, Ishmael. That didn't work out so well, as we saw in our story. But then after that, we get this name change. And again, there's this intimate relationship between Abram and God. And not only Abram, we also see this special relationship between God and Sarah. When these visitors pay them a visit and tell Abram, well, you're still going to be the father of a great nation, and your wife Sarah is going to have a baby. And what's Sarah doing when she's off in the tent? She's supposed to be making them some lunch. She's eavesdropping on the conversation, isn't she? And she laughs. She laughs. Well, and then time goes on here. And then we get that story about Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 19. And we see, again, Abraham's boldness. He's got this relationship with God, and he bears his heart. He bears his heart to God, and he bargains with God, and he says, God, if I just find 50 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, will you spare their lives? Yeah, God says. How about if I find 45, God? 40? If I find 40 righteous people? How about 30? How about 20? How about just 10, God? If I find 10 righteous people, will you spare their lives? Well, we know that doesn't happen. And Sodom and Gomorrah is wiped out. We know that Lot is spared. Abraham's nephew Lot is spared from all of this. And we also know that Sarah has become pregnant, and she is going to give birth to Isaac, which means laughter. We see that wonderful exchange between God and Sarah Sarah says, I didn't laugh. No, God, I didn't laugh. And God says, yeah, you did. Yes, you did. I love that part, right? And so after all of this, Abraham is old age, and his faith is tested. His faith is tested. God says, take your son, your only son, Isaac, and lay him on the altar. Sacrifice. Several years ago at the Women of Faith event, we heard a speaker by the name of Carolyn Kent. And her son was imprisoned, I think for murder. And she wrote a book called Laying Our Isaacs Down. In other words, in entrusting our children to God's care, saying, God, I need your help here. I need your help in raising my child. And I guess, our Isaacs don't just have to be our children. Our Isaacs can be anything that we hold dear. Laying our Isaacs down on the altar. And we know the story, how Isaac's life is spared. God says, just wait. I know you are faithful. I know you are faithful. So Isaac grows up, chapter 25, and Isaac and Rebekah have 2 sons, twins, Esau and Jacob. Esau is the older boy, and he's kind of red in complexion, and he's hairy. And then Jacob is the one who comes next, and he's grabbing onto Esau's heel grabber. Um, and we know that Esau is kind of an outdoorsy sort of guy. He's a hunter, and Jacob's more of a mama's boy. He likes to stay in the house and cook, and Jacob also means trickster and conniver. This is our boys' favorite story, especially our younger son Adam, because our older son's given name is Jacob. Our JJ is a Jacob. And so Adam continually reminds his brother that he is a conniver, he is a trickster. JJ has always been one who he could pretty much sell a picnic basket in the middle of a blizzard and convince you that it really wasn't that cold. That's our oldest son, Jacob. And so we know that story, don't we, of the selling of the birthright, that Jacob tricks his brother, sells out Esau, just gives up his birthright for a bowl of hot stew. And then Jacob dresses up and he puts like animal hair on, and he goes into his father and he says, "Bless me," and he gets the birthright. So Jacob runs for his life for fear that Esau is going to kill him. Jacob grows up and he's got his own issues. We see that he is wrestling with God. We had that story, I believe, last fall, with the leg wrestling. Remember that? Jacob is on his way to make up with his brother Esau, and he falls asleep next to the brook, and God pays him a visit. He wrestles all night with God, this leg wrestling, and he pops his hip out of joint, or leg socket. So then we also see that Jacob loves two women, Rachel and Leah. He loved Rachel first, and he had to work for his father-in-law Laban. This is when he was on the run, and from here comes from Jacob and these two women, Rachel and Leah, and also from servant Bilhah come the 12 tribes of Israel. All of these sons. That's where the 12 tribes of Israel come from. So then, we get down to Jacob, and Jacob has some sons, and we know that Joseph is one of the sons, and he is Jacob's favorite because he was born to Jacob in his old age. And we know that Joseph is the dreamer, and he's got all of these dreams, and his father gives him this amazing Technicolor dream coat, and his brothers are jealous of him, and so they throw him down a well, and he's sold into slavery, and eventually he becomes the Prince of Egypt, and all of this stuff. So I'm getting ahead of myself there with that story of Joseph. So next time we'll pick up with that. But one of the things that I wanted to share with you in the story of Abram, I was wrestling with my call to ministry, and I had recently surrendered to that to become a pastor, and I was taking some classes at the University of Sioux Falls. I was taking an Intro to the Bible class, and the instructor was Dr. John Hagel, the religious professor there, one of them, and he's still teaching there. And he made the Bible come alive for me. It made me feel as if I was a part of the story. And I can remember going through Genesis. This was early on. We were just going through Genesis and the call of Abram. And it just felt so personal to me, that God was speaking directly to me, that it was all about relationship. God is still about relationship, folks. God longs to have this loving relationship with each of us. And so don't be afraid to share your heart. And God is God and we are not. We have to remember that God is above us. We are not equated to God. But God does long to have this special, intimate, personal relationship with each one of us. He wants to take us by the hand too, just like he did with Abram. And so the story, the call of Abram, it has a personal meaning for me. We're going to scoot on over now to the Old Testament. Keep reading in Genesis. I know that it has gotten kind of dry in some spots. That's okay. Just do the best you can. Skip over what you can't handle, some of that genealogy. But some of the genealogy is important when you know the backstory. Like Abraham stemmed from Noah's son Shem. So that's kind of interesting. And then the 12 tribes of Israel, where they come from, okay? So Matthew, we're in Matthew. So I'm going to start with chapter 4. We have the temptation and Jesus' ministry beginning, and then the call of the disciples. So it says, when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he left Judea and returned to Galilee. He went first to Nazareth. So this is after the temptation. He goes home first. And we know from our Luke reading here in December what happens in Nazareth. Luke chapter 4 again. We have that reading in the synagogue when he stands up and he reads the scroll and he says, this is being fulfilled right now because I am the Messiah, and they run him out of town. The hometown boy is not welcomed, right? And they almost run him off a cliff, but he escapes through the crowd. We don't get that in Matthew. It just tells us that he goes home. So he went first to Nazareth and then to Capernaum beside the Sea of Galilee. There's the Sea of Galilee here, water, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, these are two of Jacob's sons, this Zebulun and Naphtali. So 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. So go back to Isaiah 9. Isaiah 9. This is a passage we read in Advent a lot of times. The header in your Bible will read, Hope in the Messiah, in Isaiah 9. And these are the words, okay? It says, nevertheless, that time of darkness and despair will not go on forever. The land of Zebulun and Naphtali will be humbled, but there will be a time in the future when the Galilee of the Gentiles, which lies along the road that runs between the Jordan and the sea, will be filled with glory. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. So Matthew, we're going to get a lot of Old Testament references. Remember, well, this is one of them. The darkness of oppression of the government, oppression even from the church, and Jesus is going to be light to the nations. Here's our Epiphany light, okay? But we hear that. We hear the Zebulun and Naphtali. So I wanted to point that out to you. Then we get the call of the disciples. Now Matthew's version of the call of disciples is my very favorite, because we get to see Jesus walking along the shore, and he's hollering at Simon Peter and Andrew, these fishermen, first of all. And he says, come, follow me, and I will teach you how to fish for people. And then he goes on to get James and John, the son of Zebedee. So when I was wrestling with my call to ministry, right before this, I was going to church, but sporadically. I wasn't going on Sunday morning on a regular basis. And it's interesting, shortly before God reawakened my call to ministry, he reawakened my call to love fishing. I mean, fishing, rod and reel fishing. And a good friend of mine was the youth director at my home church in Laverne, and she loved to fish. And so she and I had gone fishing. We were going fishing. And she was getting kind of burnt out with the youth ministry position in Laverne. And she and I would sit there and fish, and we'd talk. And she's, I could really use some help at the church. Why don't you come along? Why don't you just help me with some activities and help me teach Sunday school on Sunday morning? God is just so cool like that. God knew just how to woo me back into this relationship with Him. And He used something that I love. Fishing, and then teaching me how to fish for people. Shortly after that, my friend resigned from the youth leader position, and guess who applied for it? And guess who was the youth director at her home church for, I think, maybe about 5 years or so? Yeah, this girl. And my relationship with God and my call to ministry reawakened, and it got to the point where I knew that I had to make a choice. Yeah, and so that's when I decided to start the process to become a pastor. But isn't that so cool? God knows our hearts, friends. God knows just what we need, and just how to do it. So after the call, and then Matthew 5, we get those Beatitudes that I love so much, all of those blessed are's, and the Sermon on the Mount. We remember in Luke, it was the Sermon on the Plain, and the wording was just a little bit different. So Matthew 5 to 7 is the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. I love all of that. And then in chapter 8, the crowds are getting larger, and they're following Jesus, aren't they? And Jesus is healing, and we get the call of Levi, also known as Matthew. And Levi is the author of our gospel here. Matthew is the author of this gospel. So today we had Matthew 10. All 12 of the disciples have now been called, including Judas. And now Jesus is commissioning them to go out and start practicing what he's been preaching, okay? And it says, don't go to the Gentiles or the Samaritans, but only people of Israel, God's lost sheep. I had missed that part before. Here in Matthew, Jesus specifically instructs them to go to the Jews, not to the Gentiles yet, not to the Samaritans, just to the Jewish people, God's lost sheep. So that's who they were to go to. Announce to them that the kingdom of heaven is near. I love that wordage. The kingdom of heaven is near you now. The kingdom of heaven is near. I can't hardly say it or read it without getting God bumps. Jesus is on the scene. The kingdom of heaven has arrived now. God incarnate in and through Jesus Christ. If we want to know God's character, we see God's character in and through Jesus. God made flesh. That's what that fancy word incarnate means, okay? So he says, but I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves. Because not everybody's going to be receptive to your message. Do you think we still have wolves in this day and age? You better believe it. And some wolves are disguised in sheep's clothing, friends. And so we have to be careful. We have to be careful. Matthew 10, 26 through 31, Jesus just says, shout it from the rooftops. Tell people about me. There's that song, Rooftops. If you YouTube it, I love that song. rooftops. From the rooftops I'll proclaim that I am yours. You know, that it's such an excellent song. Then Jesus finds out that John is in prison. He says, you go back and tell John, the blind see, the lame walk, lepers are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised to life, and the good news is being preached to the poor. Now, in Luke, we saw that John's disciples went to Jesus and said, are you the one, or should we look for another? John wants to know. And that was kind of a funny question because John and Jesus were cousins. And John baptized him? Why was John asking? Well, Jesus is again quoting from Isaiah. He's quoting from that Luke 4, when he was back at the synagogue, remember, in Nazareth. You tell John that this prophecy is being fulfilled. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are being raised to life, and this good news is being preached. So John knew, he could fade out of the limelight, and we know what happened. We know what happened to John, right? He was beheaded in prison. Then again, we get, come to me, all of you who are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. My yoke is easy, and burden is light. Boy, can we all use those words again and again, right? The Pharisees and Jesus tangle about the Sabbath day. Chapter 11, verses 15 through 21 of Matthew is a quote from Isaiah 42. Then Matthew 13, we get the farmer scattering seed and mustard seed, these parables, these stories that are going to teach a lesson. That's our text for this week, only we get Mark's version. And I like Mark's version just a little bit better of the farmer scattering seed and the mustard seed. Then John the Baptist is put to death. Mark 6 gives us the details of that. We're not there yet in Mark, but Mark 6 gives us the rest of the story. Then we get Jesus feeding the 4,000 with 7 loaves and a few small fish. Mark 8 is the same as that. But in Luke 9, we saw 5 feeding of 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And then in John 6, we get this little boy's picnic lunch. That's how the crowd is fed. But that story appears in all 4 Gospels, which means we need to sit up and take notice of that. I always call it the sardine story. Chapter 17 is the Transfiguration. We're not there yet in Mark 9. We saw it in Luke 9. That's where, Jesus goes up on the mountain and he takes Peter, James, and John, and he gets transfigured. He gets all shiny and glowing. His radiance, his glory is revealed, and Elijah and Moses show up, and Peter's so excited he wants to build these altars and just stay there forever. But, they got to come down the mountain. Doesn't matter which gospel you're reading it in. When they come down from the mountain, this changes everything. Because from here on out, Jesus is heading to Jerusalem, face to the cross. Face to the cross. So after the Transfiguration, this changes everything. We'll see that in Mark 9 here in a few weeks. Chapter 18. They start talking about the greatest in the kingdom. We saw that in Luke 2. And again, Jesus calls a kid. Hey kid, come here. Stand here. If you want to see the kingdom of God, you have to be like this kid here. Because kids get it. I don't care what you say. Kids get it. Kids are smart. Kids know. All right? So Jesus calls the kid. Hey kid, come here. Stand here. He says, beware. Don't you be looking down on any one of these little ones. Matthew tells us that each kid has an angel in heaven watching over them. Did you take note of that? Then we get this lesson on correction and forgiving. Pharisees tried to trap Jesus with a question about marriage and divorce. We saw that in Luke. I think it was like chapter 20 or something like that. Again, it's about identity. Marriage was highly patriarchal again, and women really had no voice. So Jesus is bringing voice to that. And then we get the story about the rich man. I think that kind of takes us up until this Sunday or so in our reading. Okay? Looks like I've kept you for about a half an hour. So if you're still listening in here, good for you. All right. So I hope you're hanging in there. I know some of you are listening instead of reading, and I think that is just fine. That's awesome that you're doing that. Some told me you're getting a little bit behind. Don't sweat the small stuff. Don't sweat it. Just go back and read what you can if you want to. Otherwise, just start fresh. You're not missing out on that much. Some of you are following along in Luke, and as you've noted, I think at least a lot of the stories are similar. Even in Matthew and in Mark and in Luke. At least the first part of all of this. So tomorrow we're back at it. Jam will be at Trinity, and we will have 5:30 worship. I will lead 5:30 worship, and we are in Mark chapter 4 with the farmer scattering seeds and the mustard seed. 6:30 we're going to talk about mustard seed a little bit. Confirmation will still be happening. 7 to 8 o'clock at the UMC. It's supposed to be really cold tomorrow, so I may need some help with shuffling the big kids over to the Methodist church. So watch Facebook post. I think we're having pancakes and sausages for supper. What a good night to have that when it's so cold. Keep an eye on the weather. I think we're supposed to get some snow, significant snow on Friday. Please continue to pray for Lanny Iverson and Nancy out in Sioux Falls. Lanny's still in ICU, and they thank you for all their prayers. I haven't checked in with them yet today, but keep those blessers up. Keep them going, okay? All right. We'll see some of you tomorrow night. It's good to be back. It will be good to be back among you. I missed you very, very much. Sleep well. Bye for now.